thank you very much for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. I'm delighted to connect with Unisinos in Brazil. And I think it's very exciting that one of the things that Zoom makes possible is these kinds of cross-country connections and collaborations. I'm a professor, as you mentioned, at the University of Arizona, which is close to the US-Mexico border. I am a first-generation college graduate, so I was born and raised in this area, actually, in Arizona. I went to Chicago for my PhD, but I was fortunate enough to be invited to return as a faculty member here at the University of Arizona. And I think that the proximity to the border has influenced me a lot. My family goes back several generations here in the Arizona region, so that very much the cultures of the Southwest, predominantly Spanish, Mexican, and indigenous traditions, are very much part of Southwestern culture in the United States. And I think that as a child, we are only about 40 minutes from the Mexican border. And I remember that some very formative influences were family trips across the border. And I just remember as a child experiencing or coming face to face with desperate poverty, severe poverty. I mean, of course, there is tremendous poverty in many developing countries, and in the United States, there's plenty of homelessness and poverty. But across the border in Nogales, Mexico, you see some of the slums, some of the favelas, with really severe realities of poverty. People living in makeshift structures, without plumbing, without water, without electricity. And I remember that was an important influence on me that very much like broadened my consciousness of the plight of people beyond my border, in the United States. And when I was a college student, in the late 80s and 90s, there was a movement called the Sanctuary Movement. And the Sanctuary Movement was a movement of various churches, including Catholic churches, that were providing a sanctuary for immigrants, refugees that were fleeing parts of Central America in particular. And again, that was also a very formative influence on me. And so I eventually decided that I wanted to study religion, and I wanted to study theology in particular. And so I was very much drawn to the liberation theologians. I remember too, the Brazilian Dom Helder Câmara, and some of the great Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, and many of the other theologians that were writing about being Christian in the context of global injustice, in the context of great poverty and inequality and oppression. And that was all very influential on me. So I ended up at the University of Chicago, and I wrote my dissertation on Gustavo Gutierrez. And Simone Weil, who's a French philosopher, kind of Catholic Jewish philosopher, a remarkable intellectual. But so I wrote my dissertation on her. I had grown up listening to hip hop. It was very much part of my upbringing, but I never thought that it would intersect with the study of religion. I thought they were completely like separate paths. But when I was in Chicago, the University of Chicago is situated on the South Side, and it's predominantly an African American neighborhood. And in many ways, hip hop was very much alive, very vibrant in the neighborhoods around the University of Chicago. And I remember stumbling into a lecture. This was in the 90s, at the University of Chicago, by Michael Dyson, and the topic of the lecture was on God and hip hop. And I was absolutely like gripped by the title and the thought of considering hip hop in relation to religion. And it was the first time that I think I started to pay more attention to how frequently many rappers invoked God. And it's the first time I started paying attention to some of the spiritual or the religious dimensions of hip hop. Before that, I was always captivated by the rhyming styles of hip hop, by the creative, kind of the magic of language, of the way a great MC, a great rapper would captivate a listener's imagination by almost like using language as a spell, as an incantation, the way that the rhyme schemes could really, it was the first time that I was really kind of taken by the spoken word and by poetry. It was really, what I guess I'm basically saying is that hip hop was my introduction to the art of poetry. And then I slowly started paying attention more and more to what they were saying, the social issues, the human rights issues, and of course, as I mentioned, some of the religious themes. My brother was actually a break dancer, a b-boy, and I remember here in Tucson, Arizona, the culture of breakdancing would, they would compete as a dance group. They would compete against other crews. And in many ways, it was really just, it was considered, at the time, it was considered cool. But it was really a peaceful enterprise. It was very different from anything that resembled gang life. It was about the art of creative bodily expressions in dance. So that was another important, I think, influence on me. So when I got the position at the University of Arizona, I thought that there were classes in rock and roll. There's classes here on the history of jazz. There's classes on classical music, but nobody was doing anything on hip hop. And I thought it was a tremendous oversight and omission. So I created a class on religion and hip hop. And over the years, it's, it grew and grew. And at one point, I was teaching the class with 350 students in the class, and it's still a large lecture class. And we look at the origins of hip hop. So I actually did want to say something briefly about the origins of hip hop before specifically talking about the more spiritual and kind of religious aspect. Just in case you're not too familiar with the origins of hip hop in the United States, I think it's well agreed upon that it developed in the South Bronx of New York City, roughly in the 1970s, maybe around 1973 is the traditional birthday of hip hop. And at the beginning, of course, it was an underground movement. It didn't have very much, didn't get played on the major radios, didn't get a lot of media attention in the early years. The music television station called MTV in the 1970s and 80s was dominated by rock music. And hip hop was, and not only hip hop, but most Black music was almost entirely ignored by MTV. Finally, with Michael Jackson, he kind of opened the door for various Black artists, where MTV started playing various kind of Black artists, Prince, and then other Black artists, and then of course later on hip hop. So it started off as an underground expression, and in its like initial form, of course, it was kind of giving the mic to young Black and brown kids and allowing them to tell their story. I mean, it was that simple. Like, tell the story of where you're from. What are the struggles that you face in your life, your dreams, your hopes and aspirations. A lot of it was rendering visible a lot of groups that in the United States that had been historically invisible and historically marginalized and ignored. So this is again in the 1970s. So it's on the heels of the civil rights movements of the 1960s. And so hip hop in many ways is a continuation of aspects of civil rights, even though it's a more of an artistic expression as opposed to a political expression. Of course, it's an artistic movement. It's about the art of language, the art of poetry, about the art of beat making, graffiti writing, and breakdancing. So early on, in many ways, hip hop was in fact a defiant expression, but it was defiance through celebration. It was about the defiant potential of joy, of dance for a lot of Black and brown kids in the United States here. So some of the early figures, I think that any kind of beginning of hip hop begins with the mention of three crucial figures: Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, DJ Kool Herc, and Africa Bambaataa. And those three figures were kind of like the pioneering figures of the late 1970s and 1980s in hip hop. And the song in particular that stands out to me, and maybe I can share the screen to at least give you a very short taste of Grandmaster Flash's very important song called The Message. It was one of the first, and this is in the early 1980s. It's one of the first to do something that is a little more socially conscious. And it was one of the first to kind of give you a snapshot of what it's like to live in parts of some of the most like impoverished urban areas of the United States. So I'm going to just play a short clip here. Let me share the screen. That's actually my book, but I just wanted to play a short piece of Grandmaster Flash's. So I know that was a very short clip. We're not allowed to do anything much longer, but actually, I think if you were able to see that it already gives you a nice sense of what the song is about. The refrain of the song is that it's like a jungle. Sometimes it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. And if you noticed some of the images gave you a snapshot of parts of the South Bronx and some of the urban blight of those neighborhoods, the poverty, the burnt out buildings, the kind of the infrastructure, the decayed infrastructure of parts of, again, kind of impoverished parts of American life. And it was one of the first songs to kind of give expression to some of the struggles and the frustrations, the pain of living in parts of the what was called the ghetto or the barrios or the favelas, and give you a snapshot of life in those circumstances. So I think that was a really important turning point in the history of hip hop. That kind of some of the music of hip hop before that was more party oriented. And I guess in general, I could say, and this is a very kind of an important general overall point about hip hop, is that there are party centric elements of hip hop, and there are more socially conscious aspects of hip hop. And I think a lot of times people disagree over what's more important. There's some people that only like the socially conscious hip hop, and others that are drawn more to the party style of where the point of the music is not a social analysis, but it's about dance. It's about celebration. It's about the beauty and power of music and the joy that music could elicit in the listener. So you a lot of times have those different camps in the culture of hip hop. But the truth is they intersect, of course. And there are so many of the great artists, if you look at long after Grandmaster Flash, there's intersections of both. After the period of the 1970s and 80s, the early period, hip hop started to expand and grow and started to take on characteristics of a lot of the neighborhoods, a lot of the local neighborhoods and states in which it was found, that it spread to. So there were aspects of hip hop developing in New Orleans that was different from the hip hop in Houston or the hip hop in the Bronx. It was different than what was happening on the West Coast in California. But you certainly had in the 1980s and 90s the rise of gangster rap music. In many ways, gangster rap is probably the greatest example of kind of what would be very much contrary to what I'm claiming. I'm claiming that there's a strong spiritual and religious dimension. Gangster rap is probably like an argument against that, because gangster rap tended to be the gangster rap of the late 80s and the 1990s tended to be very violent, vulgar, very sexist, very homophobic. And it had all of these problems. And at the same time, it was also talking about some of the struggles of being Black in American life, in some of the worst ghettos. In the case of NWA, the group NWA, they were talking about what it's like to live in Compton, California, and the bigotry of the police and the abuses of the police. And this is before people had cell phones. So the police could do whatever they want to some of the residents of some of these like poor neighborhoods, and Black lives were treated often callously and cruelly. And there were all sorts of abuses. And again, it wasn't the age of the cell phone where, some of these abuses now are caught on phone, caught on video. So gangster rap in many ways, although it could be vulgar and violent and sexist, it was also capturing a lot of the struggles and the injustices of American life. I think what you have, because I want to kind of like eventually here jump to the spiritual and the religious dimension, but I want to say that hip hop has grown and changed so much over its young life. It's still a very relatively young genre that developed again in the 1970s and developed in the 80s and 90s. As we entered the 1990s and then into the 2000s, you saw more and more groups appearing and a variety of voices and perspectives. You had greater representation of female artists. You had greater representation of artists that challenged gangster rap and the violence of gangster rap and the machismo of gangster rap. And they were showing a greater diversity of American life and different perspectives from Black and brown communities that were kind of critical of some of the violence and the materialism of the genre of gangster rap. But I'd have to say that one of the interesting developments post 2010 or so was that you have these, not only has hip hop gone global, which is of course like an example in whether it's in Brazil, even in Russia, Putin has like been tough on some hip hop artists for criticizing the government. In many ways, hip hop in its global manifestation has often been a voice of protest. It's been a voice of defiance against many of the injustices and kind of oppressive conditions of life, whether it's in Latin America or in Europe, or in Africa. And of course, it's also taken on a lot of the characteristics of the local cultures and traditions and the musical customs of those various countries in many ways. But I would say that one interesting development in 2010 or so, there was a greater, a deeper introspective element to hip hop, of like these artists that were looking at themselves and confronting many of their own shortcomings, their own fears, their own anxieties, their own even depression. That was, I think, generally speaking, pretty novel. Hip hop of the past never wanted to reveal vulnerability. It was supposed to be like to represent toughness and, you know, the gangster image. But it's changed so much where artists now talk about, you know, issues of depression and anxiety in ways that was unheard of in the early decades of hip hop. Okay. I know I've left out a lot of developments in the culture of hip hop, but I really do want to focus here on, is there a spiritual or religious dimension to hip hop? I would make the argument that one of the clearest ways in which there is a connection with the biblical tradition is, of course, the tradition of the prophets. The classical biblical prophets pronounced oracles and messages that they were receiving from God, but they were often in the form of poetry and even song, a lot of the great prophets of the Bible. And in fact, there's a really interesting text in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 33, in which the prophet Ezekiel is compared to a poet or singer. And I think that's really fascinating, because he's compared to a poet or singer. It makes us think that Ezekiel's oracles were not only in poetic form, but more than likely they would have been sung or even like chanted. So I think that's one aspect, of course, of the tradition in which the prophets were similar to what we consider now the form of rap, chanting. But of course, with the prophets, there was a special concern for the plight of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the outsiders. And for the prophets, God was calling us to embrace the poor and the vulnerable, the needy, and the stranger, and that God appeared in the form of these outcast figures. And so I think of like the classic figure of Moses. I think this is a decisive moment in the entire biblical tradition. The prophet Moses, remember, he's raised in the Egyptian court. He is an adopted child, but he's raised in the aristocracy of the Egyptian court, and he witnesses a slave being beaten, and he's moved with compassion for the abuse of the slave, and he intervenes to prevent that abuse, and he accidentally kills the Egyptian who was abusing the slave. I think it's a formative moment in the Bible because it tells us that Moses basically took the side of the slave against the Egyptians. Even though he was a person, he was part of the aristocracy, he was a person of great wealth, of great, he would of nobility and of privilege. And yet he took the side of the slave. And I think that tradition influenced the entire biblical tradition. Of course, the figure of Jesus is really follows in the footsteps of Moses, in that he takes the side of the poor and the widows and the outcast. So I think that there's a lot of problems. It's not like hip hop as a genre is not problematic at times. There are troubling aspects of hip hop. I definitely would be the first to acknowledge that. But in its finest moments, I think hip hop is in continuity with the vision of the biblical prophets, of shining a light on conditions of poverty, of raising a voice against experiences of racism and bigotry. And this is something that I think you see hip hop in many, many different contexts, being the voice of the disenfranchised, the voice of the dispossessed. I think that is really a central aspect of hip hop culture. So the prophetic elements, I think, are central to hip hop. In general, to look at the issue of religion in a broader sense than that, we talk about in my classes on campus. I ask some of my students why do they think that hip hop tends to have a greater preoccupation with religious or spiritual concerns. One possible explanation is, of course, that hip hop reflects some of the culture, and here I'm going to just speak about in North America. It reflects some of the religious leanings of African Americans. There was a Pew study done around 2007 or 8, and it looked at some of the religious preferences of Americans. And what stood out is that African Americans, and they asked question like, do you believe in God? How important is religion in your life? They asked questions like, are you affiliated with a religious tradition? And by and large, African Americans ranked the highest in claiming belief in God. It was like over 90% claimed to believe in God. And very high percentages of African Americans claimed that religion was very important in their lives, and that they had some affiliation with religion. So I guess one of the reasons I think that a lot of Black music in North America tends to be interested in religious and spiritual questions is that it reflects some of those leanings, some of those inclinations. And so I think if you look at some of the major artists in hip hop, many of them were kind of using the poetry of hip hop as a way to like explore their beliefs and to kind of search themselves. And if you look at in North America, figures like Tupac, Tupac Shakur is a very important figure in the history of hip hop. He was truly obsessed with God. God appears in so many of his songs, and it's not a simplistic belief in God. I think Tupac was often compared to the book of Job, in that Job was like wrestling with God and trying to make sense of how does one believe in God in light of like suffering, in light of anguish, of injustice. And so Tupac was very much like a Job-like figure who was like, I think he embraced God as kind of a, as an element um, of hope in very difficult circumstances. But he's very complex and interesting on the question of God. Other artists like the figure of DMX, who's another very important figure in 1990s hip hop and into the 2000s. And like prayer and spirituality is absolutely central to so much of his music. Another figure like Lauryn Hill. Lauryn Hill was just a remarkable figure. Her album, it's called The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, is a classic in the history of hip hop. And it's like flooded with religious sensibilities. And then, coming into more our own time, so many artists like the Chicago rapper Chance the Rapper, or of course Kendrick Lamar, the most famous, one of the most famous contemporary rappers. Kendrick Lamar in particular has been obsessed with religious themes. In fact, Kendrick Lamar, if you look at his records, some of his major works, there's a noticeable difference between his mixtapes, his earliest mixtapes, and the major studio albums. And the difference is that he underwent a religious conversion, and he became increasingly preoccupied with religious themes in his music after that religious conversion. So his album called Good Kid, Mad City, his one of his first major studio albums, is very much like also wrestling with God. And for example, there's one song called Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst. Let me maybe show you actually, there's not a video for it. It's just a song, but it's from Good Kid, Mad City. Actually, I'll skip that. I want to mention the next one. In his next album, he has this remarkable song called How Much a Dollar Cost. And it's this remarkable song about Kendrick Lamar encountering God in the face of a beggar, of somebody who's pestering him for money, for a handout. And if you follow the course of the song, it turns out that the beggar is is God, and that Jesus is appearing in the form of a beggar, which is actually something that's true to not only the biblical tradition, but where God in the Bible often appears in the form of a stranger or outsider, as in the stories related to Abraham. God appears to Abraham as a stranger. But even outside of the Jewish and Christian traditions, that in the Hindu tradition, God often appears in the form of beggars. So I think it's a really fascinating song. Let me at least give you a taste of the sound, the music. Again, we can't listen to too much of it, unfortunately, but it's a remarkable song in which he's having this dialogue with himself about how much a dollar cost. And what he's basically saying is that it's kind of like that he's challenging himself against the temptation to sell his soul. He's describing a rapper who has achieved success and has a lot of money, but he's basically saying that his soul is worth a lot more. And he goes through this like spiritual journey in the song, and part of his enlightenment or awakening occurs this recognition that God is in the form of the beggars of our world, in the form of the poor, the disenfranchised, the oppressed. And so I think that theme is central to the biblical tradition. He also, I wanted to show you a clip of this song. This is Kendrick Lamar's, the album called Damn. And this is a more popular song of his called Humble. And I just wanted to show you it's saturated with religious themes. He, in fact, appears in what appears to be like a cathedral, and he's dressed in priestly vestments. So I wanted to show you a piece of this. So although again, too bad we can't listen and watch the entire video, because it kind of shows that he's a conflicted figure, that part of him is a rapper of great success and money. And you notice he's on that table surrounded in money and girls. But he's actually drawing a contrast that he's struggling with these things, and that he's kind of searching for a higher path, and trying to like be true to his soul, to the well-being of his spirit, and not lose himself in material wealth and material like pleasures. So Kendrick Lamar is one of the first rapper to win a Pulitzer Prize for music. He won a Pulitzer for the album Damn. And he's such a complicated artist. I guess in general, I would say that, and this is a generalization, of course, that North American hip hop tends to be drawn by basically kind of general Christian ideas outside of any denomination. And sometimes some aspects of hip hop were drawn to very kind of unorthodox spiritualities. I've really been very interested in how hip hop has continued to develop in Latin America with the rise of reggaeton, which is a huge and very important genre the artist Bad Bunny, for example, is one of the most popular artists right now in the world. He has extraordinary reach, and he actually has a Catholic background, not surprisingly. He's from Puerto Rico, and he has that Catholic background. I'm not sure if he's Orthodox Catholic, but you could tell that it's important. The values of Catholicism are still important to somebody like Bad Bunny. But then, the way hip hop developed in Cuba, for example, it was fascinating because it started the traditions of American hip hop merging with Cuban music and Cuban tradition. So I wanted to play you a song from the group known as the Orishas. They're wonderful. Like as you could tell, the fusion of aspects of Cuban music with American hip hop made for a formula that has continued to develop. And I want to learn more about the Brazilian hip hop scene, but I know that it's a very rich and complex scene, and I want to study Portuguese just to learn more about some of the artists. But I've been listening to Baco Ishu do blues, and in many ways, the invoking the god Ishu is very much like the tradition with the Orishas. The god Ishu is a god of the crossroads in African Yoruba traditions. And I think it's fascinating. In both Cuba and Brazil, you had the fusion of Catholic traditions with African religion. And it seems to me that in his name alone, that he's invoking that tradition of representing the struggles of African peoples, throughout the Americas. And I guess in the end, coming to an end here, that I think, again, there are problems with hip hop. There's the vulgarity, the history of sexism, the materialism where, a rapper's success is judged by how much money they make, or the cars that they have, the jewelry. All of that is very much a valid criticism of the culture of hip hop. But I think if you only see that part, you miss out a tremendous complexity of hip hop, of artists that are giving voice to the struggles of the poor and the outcasts. And you see that particularly in the Americas, that hip hop is in many ways the voice of the struggles of indigenous peoples, of African peoples, of in North America, African Americans or Latinos, Mexicans of the Southwest, who also have histories of abuse and colonialism and mistreatment. And so I think it's a remarkable art form, in that, I guess in the end, what I'd want to say is that, in a sense, even though I emphasize that hip hop is something that emerged in the South Bronx in the 1970s, the truth is that the idea of poetry with music, connecting poetry to music, is ancient. And from the very beginning of, like, the ancient Greeks, all of their poetry was sung. It was chanted. It was more like music than it was just poetry. And so what I'm saying is that, in that sense, hip hop is a recovery of these ancient traditions of where poetry was recited and chanted and sung. And so it's an extraordinary form and extremely creative. And I think, if anything, it will only continue to be that, because like I said, the tradition of connecting poetry to music is ancient. And I think we'll increasingly see artists that use this venue, use the genre of hip hop to express themselves and to be creative and to express their sorrows, to express the injustices that they see in the world and their hope for a better world. So I think all of these are a part of the culture of hip hop. So I think I'll stop there. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them. Again, I really want to learn more about Brazilian hip hop. I know it's incredibly rich.